Very pleased to be here today. And why did I get involved? I'm a family doctor, looking after, patients for the last 42 years. 25 years ago, when I first came before CHIP, I began to notice that there were issues after I was regaled by the elders in the first few visits to the community. As a physician, as a human being, I am absolutely compelled to report what I see. And, thankfully in my situation as a family physician, I was able to pursue further investigation, which I did to the best of my ability. I think as a resident of this Mother Earth, I'm a physician, but just as a resident, I, like all of us, it's our duty to help our fellow man. So basically, that's what I started out as, a resident of Mother Earth and a physician to boot. Why wouldn't any of us do what we can to help in situations where there's obviously issues that we can influence. And that's my summary.
Thank you, John. We'll go over to Jesse now.
Hello again. So to answer that question, why did I get involved? What comes to mind for me, because I grew up in Kikino, and we grew up from the land, so that it's very common to hunt, to harvest berries. My late mushum, who was my dad's father, that's all he ate. He preferred to eat wild meat. So my cousin, they raised him, and he was the best hunter in Kikino. Like, he became a hunting guide for a while because my mushum preferred to eat from the land. And so whenever I would go to my, to my grandparents' house, there was always some kind of wild meat boiling. So whether it was duck, there was moose meat, deer meat. He loved deer meat. Chickens, rabbits. That's how we grew up. And then we started getting these messages in the late 1900s, early 2000s. Don't eat the meat. And it was just a weird time, like, growing up in our community, because it was like we went from this like quiet, isolated community to all of a sudden there's traffic everywhere, there's big trucks everywhere, there's gas wells going up. And that was the time that we were being told not, like, same as in these stories here, we were being told not to eat the meat. Well, my mushum did. Like, you just don't change your diet all of a sudden. But they died early, they died young in their 60s. And we don't know, like, we didn't have those health studies of like how much did the foods, and then you add in the processed food. So are we eating sick meat, adding in the processed foods? And then because we're on a corridor to the tar sands, our highway, which was a peaceful highway, as families we would walk on this highway. It was a gravel road, and it got paved. It's now an industrial freeway. And then, and I spent time, because my grandparents had moved to Fort McMurray, right? To go work there. We're not exempt from that. And so, I was able to become aware of this group called Keepers of the Water. So all these pieces were coming together for me. And at that time, I didn't know that tar sands was one of the biggest industrial projects on the planet. But when I became involved with Keepers of the Water, I met people like John O'Connor, Dr. John O'Connor, and these other people who were bringing forward these, other facts. Like, we came from the communities, but then we were meeting people who had like this data, these scientists, like, so it was like, it was like, if this is allowed to happen here, this is gonna be allowed to happen in other places as well. And it's affecting my community, and I live like 3 hours away from Fort McMurray. So yeah, I'll just stop there and I'll pass it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse. For context, I grew up out east in Ontario, and when I first got to know folks from Alberta, one of the first things that I heard was how it was common for young people, especially young men, to tough it out and go work on the rigs for a few years straight out of high school, make more money than they know what to do with, and then return south and ignore what was going on. And the tailings ponds are a result of the oil sands and the production, an energy producer that, if you listen to industry and Danielle Smith, benefit everyone in the province, our economy, our international status. But the communities downstream and in the area are the ones who receive the least benefits, and they pay the highest price. Growing up outside of the province, there was this very strong narrative that I heard that made it seem like everyone in the province stood behind the oil sands and that they were in support of it. But since moving here and getting to know folks, that's not true. There's a lot of folks, such as you all on the call, who do care about this and who are concerned about what's going on and who are impacted by it. But to break that dominant narrative in media that's being portrayed, it's going to take a lot of voices, and it's going to take all voices. To me, it's particularly important because I believe that we have a responsibility to use our voice and our positions to support one another. And in my work with CPAWS, we have this mission that guides our work to protect Alberta's lands and waters. And then we have this mega operation happening that's destroying the land, destroying the waters, the groundwater, the surface water, the river, and it's negatively impacting a lot of folks and their livelihoods and their quality of life. And we have a responsibility to support them and to use our voices to call for change and to be loud enough that industry and the provincial government and the federal government can't ignore it anymore and can't keep making excuses. I'll pass it to Paul, I believe, is next.
Yeah, Paul's our final panelist. Paul, I wondered if, in addition to introducing yourself and your interest in this issue, you can give a 30-second overview of what tailings actually are. There was someone asking about that in the chat, and if there are ways we can reduce or remove them. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, you bet. So why did I get involved? Well, I have to go back to two strong influences in my distant past. One living in a mixed Métis First Nations community in my youth, Gruard, which is a community on the west side of Lesser Slave Lake. And, you know, there was plenty of self-sufficiency. We were all living with wood stoves and hunting and eating fish year round, picking berries. And then moving to Slave Lake, getting involved in academics at a young age, and discovering the first alarm bells, the first sirens of environmental damage. And many of us were greatly influenced by a book called The Limits to Growth by by an organization called the Club of Rome. And so since then, late 70s, you know, I've come to realize that there's definitely something very, very wrong with how we're functioning, and that we're on the road to hell if we continue on this current path. So when pulp mills were being built in the 80s throughout Alberta, I did get involved in activism to change the technology or to reduce their impacts, and then that led to my first sort of awareness of the real problems with the tar sands way back in '97. So I collaborated with Pembina Institute at that time to work on some issues, but we didn't make any headway. We haven't made much headway, and so now I'm seeing some possible strategies that could finally change things. We're at a point where we still have to assess the damage that's been done. We have to prevent further growth of the industry. and there's a lot yet to understand, and of course there's a lot of data that's still hidden by industry and government. Now, going to that question of what are tailings and how are they produced, it's pretty simple. The industry takes, I'll use 1 ton of ore as an example. 1 ton of ore will produce about 1 barrel of bitumen. So a big bucket will dig that ore out, put it in a hot water bath, add some sodium hydroxide, which used to be called lye soap, and and then the froth bubbles to the top. The froth is removed, cleaned, and that becomes the bitumen. And then there's a bunch of sand and water left. So that sand and water that's left becomes tailings, and the water portion sort of rises to the top in the tailings ponds, and the sand sinks. And then they add other chemicals too, not just sodium hydroxide. But that sodium hydroxide is a strong caustic, and it makes numerous chemical changes to all the different substances in oil sands ore. So oil sands ore is of the solid portion, it's mostly sand, but there's about 6 or 7% minerals, metals, and other materials, and clay. So a very complicated mixture is produced by their process. So that ore, as it sits in the ground, is benign and nothing happens to it. There's no known or significant harm to groundwater. But as soon as it's extracted and the hot water is added and the chemical is added, the devil is released, so to speak. So heavy metals are released. There's actually 100 different molecules in oil sand ore. And I've looked at it closely. There's about 8 to 10 substances in their metals mostly that are reactive. And as soon as the caustic is added in the extraction process, those compounds become a problem. So that's it in a nutshell. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Paul. So I have one more question for the panelists before we go over to open Q&A. And what I really want to understand here is what's important right now with tailings, and how can people help or get involved? So the questions would be, what are you personally, what's really important for your work, and what are you working on in regards to tailings, and how can people support that, whether they're physicians or otherwise? So I'll go to John first, and we'll follow the same list here. Thank you.
Get myself off mute here.
Sorry about that. You should be good now.
That's right. Well, the tailings ponds, there's 19, at last count, 19 massive tailings ponds of toxic water. The construction started in 1967. The berms, these massive walls of basically mud and mud, basically soil, that are used to hold these tailings ponds waters back from the Athabasca River are engineered, designed, and constructed to leak. That's been confirmed by industry, by government, and by independent science. These have been leaking into the groundwater and surface water for decades. One of them, I estimated, and this was confirmed by checking with government data, has been leaking at the rate of an Exxon Valdez a week into the surface and the groundwater and heading downstream. These tailings ponds, the chemicals that are in them are highly carcinogenic. They're endocrine disruptors. They can trigger autoimmune diseases. All of these have been detected in communities downstream. As far as the Beaufort Sea and the Arctic Ocean, myself and my wife were in Nunavik in March of 2023 at the first Dene Water Summit, and we heard countless stories from small communities across the Arctic that experienced the same environmental changes and the health issues that have been documented in the community of Fort Chip. But like Fort Chip, these communities have been told by authorities, by feds, the provincial authorities, and of course led by industry, that you're too small a sample size to make it significant. We can't draw any conclusions. This has been the mantra that has been recited again and again to communities that are all Indigenous. You would not see this happening upstream of a white community. This is systemic racism. This is eco-genocide. We can influence what's happening by just speaking. One thing that I have to describe, in 2008, in the midst of all the craziness of the media involved around Fort Chip and stuff like that, myself and my wife decided that we would start to work part-time back in Nova Scotia, where I worked when I came to Canada in 1984. So we were going back and forth between the East Coast and Alberta. I got an email and then a phone call from Richard Rockefeller. He was a family physician in Maine, but a great-grandson of the original founder of Standard Oil. So to make a long story short, he arranged to meet us in Yarmouth in Nova Scotia. He flew his plane to the airport. We met him. We spent half a day with him. He had taken his plane and several colleagues and flew to Fort Chip on the strength of the stories that he'd been reading in the media. He spoke to some of the community members himself. He had a burger at Mrs. Maw's Cafe. He sort of made himself at home for the weekend and heard lots of stories. He'd also done some research himself prior to going to Fort Chip. But his message to me before he left to go back to Maine was that, John, keep doing what you're doing. You're on the right track. And this is a member of the Standard Oil family. I thought that was, if I needed any reassurance back then, it was very resoundingly telling me that not to stop. And of course, since then, professionally and personally, I've witnessed, I've gotten to know, I have had papers that I've read, peer-reviewed, robust, published papers that confirm everything that I saw clinically as a physician, and confirm all of the concerns that the traditional knowledge keepers, the elders, were expressing ever before I came to Fort Chip. This is all happening in real time. This is impacting communities that we can influence more locally, but it's happening all over the world. It is incumbent on us, it behooves us to speak as loudly as we can and to not stop, to the point where, you know, it sometimes has been like speaking into a vacuum, but many voices speaking into a vacuum. Also, we've been drowned out by right-wing governments, by industry, by the industrial political complex. But it's our duty as I said earlier, residents of Mother Earth, to protect our brethren and to call it out for what it is.
Thank you, John. Sorry, were you finished? I'm not sure if you're hearing me, John. Powerful calls to action and very informative pieces here, John. Thank you for sharing.
I'm sorry if it came on too strong, but it's been sort of building up, and you know, especially with what's happening in our southern appendage, you know, with the influence that that's having on Canada, and then our latest PM and all of the efforts that are being made to undermine what he's doing by the other side, by the right wing, the industrial political complex. I think it's time we act.
Yeah, thanks again, John. Very, very powerful comments. And yeah, it may come across strong, but there can be no doubt that what we've tried so far has not worked. So, you know, we need to keep working, and we can't slow down right now. Over to Jesse.
Yeah, thank you, John. So just to clarify, because I know for our group, we talk about tailings a lot and we assume that everybody knows what we're talking about or what they are. But first, Paul was talking about what the tailings are, and just to put it very simply, is it's the toxic waste that's left over from the extraction of bitumen. And they're using more and more chemicals because at one time when they started in the 50s, it was called conventional oil. And what that meant was it was easy to get out. It was on the surface. There wasn't a lot of work required to get it out. That's all gone. Conventional oil is gone. So what we have left in the tar sands is unconventional oil, which means it's deeper in the ground. It's harder to get out, it's harder to separate, so therefore they're using even more chemicals. And so all of the chemicals that are used, there's a waste that's left over, a toxic waste, which is called tailings ponds. And there's 19 of them in the Fort McMurray region alone. Keep in mind there's tar sands in the Peace River, Wabasca Big Stone area, in the Cold Lake area, and in the Fort McMurray area. The scary thing is all of these tar sands areas have tailings, but the other ones are storing their tailings underground. So we can see these ones from Fort McMurray because they're open pit tailings ponds. And they're completely toxic. You may have heard like birds can't even land on them, they die. It's very surreal when you go up there. You know, if you haven't to drive up there, it looks like there's desert, like you'll drive and all of a sudden there's just sand, like it looks like desert. There is gunshots. So there's gunshots everywhere going off to try and prevent the birds from landing. There's all of these scarecrows, and then the tailings ponds themselves. And people drive through this every day, so the workers are exposed to this, the people that work in the tar sands, and we have very little information of how the tar sands affects the people because that's not being made public. The statistics, what are the cancer rates? What kind of cancers are people getting? What kind of sicknesses? What we do know is from the people from Fort McKay who have been speaking openly about it, they have all kinds of skin rashes. They can't obviously drink the water there. They've been told not even to bathe in the water. The air that they're breathing, like they are, it's inhumane what's being allowed to happen there, because there's 30 some companies, some of the biggest companies in the world are completely surrounded the community of Fort McKay. And these people are, and so they're told all kinds of things like, oh, the threshold for this chemical, everything's good. That's what they're told. Everything's safe, everything's good. everything's okay. The community has had to evacuate more than once because there's been, toxic chemicals leaking into the air and things like that. And so, and then to what John said about the tailings, that I wanted to help clarify as well. So what he was speaking about, that these tailings ponds are leaking. They are leaking at the rate of what he said, an Mobil spill. So that's going straight into the Athabasca River and the tributaries that Al and Adam had also talked about, like the Firebag. Like there's all these little rivers and streams. They all flow north to these communities. So these chemicals are making their way in high concentrations to the communities down north, which eventually goes into the Arctic Ocean, which goes to other places in the world. Then there's the treated tailings. So what the companies in the Alberta government are doing is they're saying, we can treat these tailings now, and we're just gonna dump them into the Athabasca River. So this is where Paul got involved, and he took all of the information that the companies were providing and looked at their science along with other scientists like Ian Peace, who was in the video, and they looked at that science to say, this is not going to be safe. There's going to be high levels of naphthenic acid and saline in what they're calling treated water. And even that alone, and I'll take 3 more minutes, even that alone, they can't call it water. It is not water. It is not the components of water. So we call it what it is, toxic waste. The government, what all of their poison, they call treated water, because there is, there's water in it, but there's also many other things. So you can't call it water. And so for us, it's like, for me personally, like, looking at it affects everybody. So people say, well, how does this affect me if I'm in Vancouver or if I'm in Toronto? We are experiencing climate change. We are in a drought. In Alberta, we're in a drought. And so with the tailings, what they want to do is they want to dump it, just the same thing with carbon capture storage, so that they can increase extraction. Right now, Alberta is the biggest oil and gas producer in the country of Canada, which means they're extracting millions and millions and millions of barrels of water a day. And so just to make 1 barrel of bitumen, it takes 4 to 6 barrels of fresh water. They are extracting millions of barrels of bitumen a day from Fort McMurray region alone. So you can imagine how much fresh water is being extracted. And so this is scary because Alberta wants to double their extraction, which means they're going to be doubling the extraction of fresh water when we're in a drought. So of these kinds of things, like dumping toxic waste, continuing to use massive amounts of fresh water, it sets a precedent for this to be allowed to happen in other places. So the communities like Fort Chip they're called sacrifice zones, because these rich elite people have decided we can sacrifice these communities at the cost, like at their expense, so we can benefit from it. But don't be fooled, because there are more and more sacrifice zones popping up because of this mentality of the petro state, or what John was alluding to, of like, we're hearing this word fascism. If we allow these companies to continue the way they are, these kinds of occurrences will be more common everywhere. So everybody has to step up and say, no, there's another reality possible. Diversification of the economy is the way we need to go. The alternative energies, we need to look at those. What are the other solutions? Because the oil and gas is not sustainable. Like, it's an old, outdated way of providing energy. And I'll stop there. I'll pass it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Jesse. Adding on to some of Jesse's and Dr. O'Connor's points, some really timely pieces right now, as Jesse was speaking to, is the potential for the release I'll just add that the federal government is working on this to evaluate the situation and decide what some paths forward could be. And I believe the recent timeline is 2027 that they're expected to make a decision. But we've been keeping a close eye on that and doing what we can to respond and to support the community's voices in that. And yeah, try to avoid these toxic chemicals being released into the waterways. We've seen time and time again that the Alberta Energy Regulator and the province of Alberta are not holding industry accountable to the standards they claim to be. There was a recent report by Dr. Kevin Timoney that really highlighted the discrepancies in reporting. And we see it too with the fines that are announced for these bird deaths where hundreds of birds have died, and the industry responsible who chose not to take action is charged minuscule fines that for them aren't even a slap on the wrist. But then they expect us to trust that if they move forward with this, well, they'll hold them accountable for that, and those will be met. So a lot of our work is also around doing what we can to try and hold industry accountable for their ongoing operations, but also for reclamation and what the future of this region is set up for. I'll mention one report that we're working right now on with Keepers of the Water is mapping out the current expansion of the tailings ponds over the next 50 years based on the reports that have already been improved. And the goal of that is to really highlight how if things continue as they are, this is only going to get worse and become a much bigger issue, and highlight the community concerns and impacts that have been experienced and continue to put pressure on the need for action and the need for change. As both Jesse and John said as well, everyone can use their voices talking about this, challenging this narrative, raising awareness, and putting pressure on your local MP, your member of parliament, or whatever network you exist within, making sure that this is known and that this is challenged and that these concerns are voiced. I'll pass it on to Paul.
So looking at the growth of the tar sands industry since especially around 2008 to today, it's been phenomenal. And it's that growth is not well understood by the general public, and it's shockingly growing very, very quickly. And there's all kinds of sort of non-public approvals, non-public mechanisms by the regulator to allow the growth without any checks and balances. Really, what's needed now is a complete environmental impact assessment of the damage of what's going on, the cumulative impacts of all the industry there, from the air emissions to the leakage into the groundwater. We don't even have a clear picture of that. It's shocking that as a first world nation that we don't even know. We don't even have all the numbers as to what's going on there. We have some idea. And, you know, when we look at what is the solution needed, well, yeah, you know, I go back to the limits to growth, the whole concept of limits to growth as outlined by the Club of Rome in the 70s. I think we really need to embrace a better understanding of our limits. Right now, the government is talking about the Alberta government has given the Alberta Energy Regulator the regulatory power now to regulate mining of metals and minerals in this province. So currently, the AER has stated that the first lithium mine will be in place sometime this year in Alberta. There's also talk about uranium mining now around Fort Chipewyan and other metals mining. Now, why this big push? Well, it's the whole critical minerals talk. So here we go again. The industrialization, the colonial industrialization is talking about electrifying to control CO2, but with no consideration of the ecological footprint of all that mining. So what we're faced with now is more mining. So in reality, if we're looking at protecting water and the environment, and we need to deal with all mining because all those mines have an impact on the health of the ecosystem and humans. So I believe that this talk of electrifying is a false narrative that suits the further industrialization of the planet with no consideration for anyone's rights, no consideration for ecological footprint, and just some talk about reducing CO2. If you look at the conclusion of studies like the limits to growth, we need to degrow. We need to get into hyper conservation. We're dealing, the problem is massive. The CO2 issue is massive, the pollution issue is massive, the biodiversity issue is massive. We're in a polycrisis state. That's the context that we're working in. We cannot isolate one problem from all the other problems. So the ultimate solution is hyper conservation, and a really radical change is how we're functioning as a society. Yet what we could do initially, we could potentially have a large impact in terms of slowing down or forcing a moratorium on any growth would be a good first step. But the problem is the growth has been so massive, the impacts of the current production of over 3 million barrels of bitumen per day it's horrible. So that has to be dealt with. But there's no way we can cope with any more growth. So I think a moratorium would be a very minimum first step. There needs to be intersectional action for sure. And I've seen some comments in chat stating that strength in numbers. So we're at a point where we need to come up with a strategy or an action that is commensurate to the problem. Talking about it, educating people is minor, but won't change anything. We need some pretty strong legal or public efforts, and we need to strategize.
Well said, Paul. A lot of specific actions, calls to action, and just insight on what we're facing here. I think to summarize what all the panelists have said is I'll lean on something Jesse told me once when I was getting riled up about an issue. I wanted to dig into the policy and really find, a way to address a certain issue with tailings. But Jesse provided a helpful reminder that, that can often be a source of distraction, can be disheartening, take a lot of our energy to fight, these systems in their court, so to speak. If we really the simplest action anybody can take, I think, is just to point out what's right and what's wrong and identify alternatives to what currently exists. Look at our own values, our own health, our own ways of living, and try and put our focus and energy into that, what's right, what's wrong, and what's an alternative way of living. That's a simple way to get involved, I think. Calling things out through social media or with your MLAs and stuff, as mentioned, is how that can be done. In addition to the specific calls to action mentioned here, like advocating for a moratorium. So that concludes our panel discussion, and we have about 10 minutes left for Q&A, which is not a lot of time, I recognize. So I do encourage people, put questions or comments in the chat. And even if we don't get to them now, we can try follow up and share that with the broader group after the webinar here. So we will open to questions now and comments. And I want to start with Richard, who's asked to provide a comment first, and then anybody else after that, please raise your hand or put something in the chat. Thank you. Over to you, Richard. You're on mute.
Thank you, Dakota. It struck me during the film that the Indigenous people or the locals, they want to invest in pipelines, which is what's creating the whole problem in the first place. When really what we have to do, as all the groups really have to really push for conversion to renewable energy. There is an upfront cost, yes, but over the long term, you save a lot of money. But then eventually you'll be able to breathe clean air and drink fresh water. You won't have any of the toxic effects from the tailings ponds or any of those sorts of things. We need to convert completely away from the fossil fuel industry, and that's a really a big ask because they have billions of dollars to fight against us. And I say us, those of us who care for the environment, but we really have to push for renewable energy. I am actually on the board of the Canadian Club of Rome. I'm also on the board of Prevent Cancer Now. And as a physician, I chaired and founded the Canadian Leukemia Studies Group. So I dealt with people who are developing acute myeloid leukemia, many of them exposed to benzene, which is high in your toxic tailings ponds. So I saw this firsthand in how much people suffered, the early loss of life, the burden on the caregivers and so forth. So I saw this, I lived through it, and I've seen this, and I just cannot stand to see that the fossil fuel industry continues to propagate itself. We really need to fight against that.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Very important points you've raised. I do want to mention Indigenous peoples aren't unanimously in support of pipelines. In fact, I think there's a pretty big oil and gas industry push to support the narrative that Indigenous peoples are more supportive than might be the reality of things like pipelines. So that's something to be aware of. And a separate but very complementary conversation of what kind of false narratives are being promoted to enable the current situation as it is. And Indigenous peoples are doing really great work leading the transition to clean energy, including through the lens of just transition. So thank you for adding that comment, Sylvia. Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any hands right now, but we do have some time left here. Meg.
Yes. Thank you ever so much. This is so stirring. I first heard about, first actually held bitumen in my hand in 1975. And I was part of a youth science thing that and we actually went up to Fort McMurray and so on. So and now I'm sure I wouldn't even recognize it because those trucks with the wheels that I couldn't even reach the top of, they're way bigger now. But as a scientist trained in chemical engineering, but also medical research, it's a really common kind of scheme to have these really complicated mixtures and then say, oh, well, like Ian was talking about, we're going to concentrate on the naphthenic acids and forget about all that other stuff over there. And it happens time and again. And it's something that we have to fight against. We have to say, no, give us the entire portfolio of what we're looking at here. Because, you know, in some areas you'll have something that's a little bit different. So there'll be more anthracenes instead of the naphthalines or something like that. But it's all really toxic. The second thing I just wanted to comment on is that in this area, this extraction has been going on for many decades. And now you're seeing, you know, the cancers and the effects on children and so on. I was an expert for the Alberta hearing up in Peace River on the bitumen emissions there. And that was relatively new. And one of the things that really struck me was the impacts on the children. I was speaking to one person who was a physio, and she said that this person who did language teaching to the small kids, she was having a terrible time because she was spending so many hours at these tiny little tables, kind of hunched over, working with these kids. And they were going to school averbal. They could not speak, these children. The children were having dreadful rashes and, a lot of really, really serious things that would be going throughout their lives. So I'm just really concerned, as dreadful as what we're looking at, it's still, there's still more, which is really sad. And I hate to say that, but there's more chemicals that we're not looking at, like I put a thing in the chat about a mercury study that I was contacted by somebody who used to work with the Alberta Research Council. And he said, no, there's mercury there too. Nobody ever talks about mercury. This is the guy who had measured the mercury, taken the samples and so on. So we published on that. So it's underreported and it's worse. And I wish I knew how to make it better. Yeah, anyway, if I can help, let me know.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks for flagging those issues. Any responses from the panelists here, or if not, we can move on.
I'd just like to say this whole topic deserves a weekend. There's so much. I've reams of stuff written out that I could refer to if we had the time. But it's such a huge topic, and the fact that the AER, the regulator, is industry, populated by industry and funded by industry. It's not a regulator. It's not an energy regulator. It's a branch of industry. Like this is absolutely horrible, and we need to do everything we can to oppose it.
Absolutely, John. I think we can already see, there's only a few minutes left in our session and we're just scratching the surface. Just as a reminder, like today's session is really, it's a World Water Day, or tomorrow is. So this is about making sure that this really critical water issue stays front of mind and we keep building our circle and staying in relation with each other and supporting each other. So I'll have some closing comments on how to stay in touch afterwards, but maybe we have time for one more. So I see somebody has their hand raised if you'd like to ask a question or comment. Yep.
My name is Michelle Baudry, and I wrote the chat where I listed about 10 groups that I belong to. And we have been talking about this very situation for decades. And my feeling is that we're never going to get anywhere unless we all get together. I am a member of Suzuki, the Lead Now Organization 350, Oceanwise, Sierra Club, Wilderness, BC Health Coalition, West Coast Environmental Law, and so on. I'm with the Sue the Big Oil. But I mean, if we don't all get together where there's power with the people, then we're just going to keep talking as we have today.
Yeah, thank you. Another interesting point. I think CAPE's view is that, we're kind of the main solution, or the main way we can work on this is by bringing our voices together. Physician voices, Indigenous voices, environmental voices, and everybody else. So today is a small part of doing that. I see we only have 1 minute left. I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time. I do want to say the easiest thing you can do right now is follow Keepers of the Water on social media. They have a newsletter. CAPE and CPAWS Northern Alberta. Pretty regularly we're putting out letters, calls to action. Keepers does a lot of amazing other work on, like I said, legal personhood, research and informative reports and stuff. So that's the easiest way to stay involved and support is follow those things, find ways to share that information, ask questions, and follow the calls to action. One example would be, I'll put in the chat here, this little blog we put together on bird deaths that are happening in the tailings ponds. There's a draft letter there you can share with ministers, MLAs, whoever you want, as well as links to, some of the information we've been talking about. So that's just one example of follow along, see what's happening, ask questions, stay involved. So that's all I have today here. Thank you for spending your time today celebrating World Water Day with us. This can be disheartening at times, but I think us coming together is the most heartening action we can do. So you're doing your part by being here, by staying informed, staying involved, and just remember, the simplest thing to do is call out what's right and what's wrong, and know what kind of world we want to live in versus the one that's being sold to us. That's all I have to say. If you need to leave now, please feel free to jump off, but maybe I'll go around the panelists again. You can say a closing and anything else you'd like before we finish if you have time. So I'll go to John first and we can go around from there. Thank you.
I totally agree with those words, Dakota. There's safety in numbers. Individual voices need to be raised. Collectively, we definitely can be heard more loudly and hopefully drown out the other side because we are truly up against it. I'm totally with you. Whatever we need to do and can do, we should do.
I'll just echo, I think you summarized it very well, Dakota. In our work very early on in Keepers, we agreed that, that we can only talk about the problems because there's a lot, that we also need to have solutions. And that's how we ended up piloting the first solar project in Fort Chip, and now they have an entire huge solar project. And I'd like to think that Keepers, contributed in our small way. So it's like we're always looking at the solutions as well, and there's many. And even for World Water Day, something simply as, thanking the water that we have and where does your water come from? And just understanding that water is sacred and giving a thank you to the water is something simple that we can do each in our own homes. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Echoing everyone else's comments, I think staying engaged. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, but this is something that needs all of our voices together if there is going to be change. So staying engaged, following along, and doing what you can to support it.
And I'll echo what John said earlier. There's lots to talk about, and we do have, I think, brain power here to move forward. It'd be great to have a couple of days to get deeper into this in a combined personal and virtual gathering. Thanks.
Thanks again, all. I will try to find a way to share this recording and the notes for everybody who wants to revisit. So thanks to you all once again. I have my water here in front of me. I'll raise it to all of you. Try and be grateful for this here today. And that's it. We'll close here. Looking forward to being in touch with everyone and continue.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much.